You're listening to a podcast from thespoilist.com. Welcome to First Contact, bringing you the greatest sci-fi hits from the 80s and 90s. Alex is going to be bringing you all the traffic and travel later on, but first we've got James with the synopsis.
Some space bikers are destroying Federation outposts, and Picard is fed up and tracks down their planet of origin and brings their sovereign on board to try and negotiate peace with these outcasts. Meanwhile, Riker takes a special interest in the monarch's chef, who appears sweet but is troubled. While negotiations make progress, Crusher discovers that there's been a murder. Could the meek chef be an immortal femme fatale bearing a centuries-old grudge? Yes.
This week's episode is The Vengeance Factor, written by Sam Rolfe, directed by Timothy Bond. It was first broadcast the week of November 20th, 1989. Alex, how did this episode underwhelm you?
It was nothing. It's interesting. Not the episode, for God's sake. Don't think that was interesting. It's interesting when we double bank recording of First Contact. We do 2 episodes at a time, we've said before on this. And sometimes as a result of that, we get these bizarre double bills where you can have similarities. It's kind of like watching The Thing back to back with The Hateful Eight. And in this case, we've watched the previous episode and this episode in one run for these podcasts. They're kind of remarkably similar in a way, in that they're both dealing with a really turgid romance plot. But last time, the other plot was kind of interesting. This is a turgid A plot to join the turgid B plot.
The thing is, not a single element is well executed. There isn't a mystery here because we literally see the murder. And really there's no one else it could possibly have been, given they only introduce 3 characters in the entire episode. There's no attempt to get under the skin of this character to give any kind of understanding. It's just, you wouldn't understand, it's a centuries-old war. Okay, fine. There's no reason to get behind the romance. There's no conflict there. And these renegades trying to negotiate them back in the planet, that's not interesting. They're not interesting characters. There's no actual conflict. It's very much they are goodies and baddies, and that's it.
But isn't it interesting to see what Kiss were doing during that out of makeup phase?
The costumes as well are a major step back in this episode. It's odd, even within the first couple of minutes, which the most interesting bit of the episode is that opening scene in the observatory, which is all done in green lighting and there's really nice matte painting, and you think, oh, that's where the whole budget of the episode went.
I'm in 2 minds about that set, you know. At first I looked at it and I thought, oh, matte painting, lighting, and then I looked at it and thought, yeah, this kind of just looks a bit like that set from the other week where Geordie was in the hole, but more brightly lit and less muddy. And it looks like they've taken that and just put in a few pipes and things.
But now that they've got these torch props, they are really going to use them.
Yeah, and even later on, when they beam down, it does kind of feel like they've just happened upon a building site. I'm just expecting any moment to see one of those chutes that you throw rubbish down from the top.
The whole drive of the episode is, we've got these marauders, I guess space pirates, if you like, space travellers, and they're just stealing so that they can live, and Picard's had enough. So it's like, this ends now. We're going to have a negotiation.
This ends now. We're going to have a negotiation. The least threatening.
My first reaction was, well, who the hell are you? What business is this of yours? You need to end this conflict. It's gone on far too long. Yeah, you're right. It has gone on a long time. What makes you think it's going to change now? Well, I've said it has to. What? So? Well, Don't you know? My space word is law.
But it's also the idea that they say, "Oh, we'll take this in 2 weeks and we'll deliver the message." It's, actually, could you have it done by Tuesday? We've got somewhere we have to be. So they're not even staying in the sector, so it doesn't affect them in any way. It's just like, oh, while we're here, let's just deal with it.
That was hilarious. That was absolutely hilarious. I've got a hair appointment, frankly. I just. What in the name of Christ? They're aboard a spaceship that can travel faster than most others in the universe.
To be fair to the episode, it starts quite well. We spoke about the enemy, which started with them beaming straight down to the planet, going straight at the problem, and here we have them beaming down to this observatory which has been ransacked. And they talk about how they've been answering hails for 2 days. And in season 1, there would have been 20 minutes in that opening in which they're listening to the hails and they're still 2 days away. And we've got a B-plot about Wesley's science project. They've cut all that out.
That's true. There was one thing that I felt like was a slight missed opportunity for a comic moment in that scene was when Worf goes over to open the door. So it's jammed. And Data comes over and just opens it easily. I would have just liked to see a sort of little look on Worf's face of, oh. I thought, oh, comic opportunity missed.
That aside, that is very amusing, Data just opening the door, but they definitely need to play up that moment a little bit. That's a good teaser. It's a good opening, which I think we have said have been improving. It's just the rest of the episode has no momentum whatsoever.
The rest of the episode feels very much like old ground again. This thing of dignitaries are beamed on board. Okay, they get off the ship, but we do spend time on board that feels very much like here's this week's strange-faced alien.
Yeah, and I mean last week, where Troy was wanting some delicious chocolate, Riker wanted to eat Utah's spicy vegetable.
He's drawn to her from the moment she walks on the ship. He just, he's always going to go for a woman with a gash in her head. That with all of those lines were just awful. Well, maybe you should cook me a meal sometime. Well, Captain Dickwad, I didn't realise we'd stepped back into the 70s here.
What's your profession? Chef. Right, good. Okay, could you not be bodyguard? No? Well, we did that with Tasha Yar. We can't do that again. And it's so thinly drawn. It seems like a first draft at best. And I'm not sure how much of this would survive to another draft. It's all so weak and generic.
So much so, I would say, that the only way that we can really analyse this episode is to look at odd moments across the place, because it's kind of pointless dealing with the plot overall, because it's just dull. It doesn't go anywhere. I mean, it's a murder mystery with no mystery, as you say.
Yeah. I suppose, if anything, it's a Riker episode. Just like last week's was a Troy episode, where we said that the man was acting incredibly creepily and you can't understand why Troy would fall for him in any way. Riker takes on that role in this episode, and it's not quite so overt.
Well, no, she is very passive the whole way until she comes into his quarters. She is really passive. She doesn't seem to particularly care, and he's sort of quite creepy and upfront. It's quite unpleasant in a way, to be honest with you.
Showing her the replicator, I think there's a very odd metaphor going on between food and sex in Star Trek The Next Generation. It's like, yes, this can give you anything that you want, but you'll have to show me how to program some of your dishes. What? Okay, fine.
What sort of weird things are you into? Plain cold water. I guess that's missionary, right?
The subtext is is just so odd. Because as you said, it's such a sterile, sexless environment that it doesn't seem that they could have any kind of normal human sexual interaction. So it just all comes across as very strange and forced and unpleasant, and always with one party who is seemingly completely unwilling.
Well, until that scene when she goes into his quarters and has he doesn't realise it, but he's solicited a sex worker.
I think the strange thing is that they're saying, oh, I believe in equality, I believe that everyone has the right to be what they want to be, and I don't know why you worship this monarch. When they are in a military with a rank system where equality goes completely against, the chain of command. So I'm not even sure what point he's particularly trying to make. She's just an employee of someone.
And I don't mean to backtrack onto what we already talked about, but what right did the Federation have to get involved in any of this? I mean, literally, they come across the wreck. They realise, it's this offshoot of this society. So we're going to go to this society and say, look, these teens are wayward and outcast. You need to bring them back. But it's just, I don't see why this is something they get involved in. It's like a group of unruly children, so people a village across have called in their parents and are taking them down there. It's not your business.
I guess the point is that they're raiding Federation property and damaging outposts, and therefore they've got to get all policemen on them.
But surely then the policeman issue should be with the raiders, not with the larger society as a whole. I mean, it just seems such strange politics to me. It's like they're blaming the larger society for the fault of the offshoot, which is it's really weird. It's like blaming a country as a whole for its far right party.
Well, it seems to me, I thought they were going to go for some kind of 1980s metaphor. These criminals represent whatever country, and the Federation represents something else. But there wasn't even anything that you could read into that, as far as I can tell. It didn't seem to be a metaphor for anything. It didn't seem to be commenting on the world as we know it. There was no morality element. It wasn't doing that thing Star Trek can do so well, and using a science fiction story to comment on something. It was just literally, these are some things that happened that weren't very interesting, and the production designer was on holiday this week. And
the negotiations, because there's quite a lot of that in this episode, and it's never anything other than dull.
Why didn't they get Riker to do the negotiations? He's really good at poker.
Well, now we know the reason that Riker didn't do. Riker did it last week, because they couldn't have had 2 consecutive weeks with the love plot and Picard negotiating. I mean, just those negotiations. It feels like they're kind of easily won very early on, and they try and make it out that this is going to be difficult, but it's kind of not. They go to them and say, "We'd like to bring you into society. How can we trust you?" "Well, we're going to make you a serious offer." "Okay, I want some fields." Well, I mean, I feel like I'm discussing EU farming quotas. It's that dull.
Is it verging on Star Wars Episode 1?
No, because that's got some good stuff in it.
There is that scene where they're negotiating about the number of seats on the council, and they say, "We want 4 seats." And the others go, "No, nobody has 4 seats." And Picard goes, "Well,
That's not necessarily bad. That could be interesting.
But I don't know how many seats are in the council to start with.
No, exactly. We have no idea how any of this kind of representation works. Alright, you want an example. You're talking about Star Wars Episode 1. That gives us a visual representation of what the Senate is. We can see each planet is represented by a pod with a senator with a few delegates in with them. Each planet has their say. With this, I have no idea how this parliamentary or whatever it is system they have works. All I'm told is no other party has that many seats. But it's meaningless to me. I have no prior knowledge, which isn't necessarily the end of the world, but there's no visual aid or anything to give me a clue as to how this works. It's just a throwaway line, which I shouldn't necessarily have to care about, and yet the episode kind of expects me to care about, because I have to be invested in some way in these negotiations. I have to think, well, these should succeed. I couldn't give a toss.
What might have been more interesting and justified the inclusion of the Enterprise is a Federation planet that is at war and has problems, and how does the Federation deal with that when they're not dealing with a single entity?
Bringing back your own. Yeah. No, I'd go with that.
No. In the future, everybody in the Federation is nice and happy, and nothing bad happens. And they eat from a replicator, and then have consensual sex, probably. And there's no toilets.
Let's talk a bit about the murder. So they're down on the Marauders' planet or base. Presumably they don't have a planet. And she's just like, my kind will live longer than yours, you old man. And then she touches him, and he has a heart attack and dies. And it sort of comes out of nowhere, but...
I guess that's supposed to be our sort of big ooh moment. It's like if they'd walked into the room, found a body, turned it over, and my God, it's got Riker's face. But it's just... I mean, nothing's happened up until this point in the episode, and then it turns out the strange cold woman is actually has a secondary motive. Well, you don't say. If it wasn't her, it would be the other one, because narratively they've written themselves into such a corner. It doesn't seem there's any other way that they can move, or at least there's no other way that they will move in this kind of show, because they've set themselves up for very particular kinds of plots at this point, and this is falling very much in line with series 1 and 2, not what I would expect from the better parts of this series.
So if you know she's the murderer all along, then what they have to do is justify her actions to you throughout the course of the episode. You have to understand her as a character, but it's also throwaway because you don't care. Yes, there was a war 100 years ago. I'm basically a weapon now, which again, these science fiction ideas, I was transformed and coded so I could murder people by touching them, and it's all just, washed over, and you can't care, you also don't understand, and it's just leaves you baffled more than anything else.
The worst bit of science that was just washed over in this episode is the picture of her that they bring up on the computer, where we see a quarter of her face, and the computer recreates the face.
Someone had been to see Blade Runner.
Yeah, exactly. This scene is key to me, because this is exactly what I think they were trying to make, is a Blade Runner type episode, because that is clearly lifted from Blade Runner, and Red Dwarf parodied it far better than that. It was so little effort though, in Blade Runner, where you're trying to see a reflection, you zoom in, you find the reflection, whatever, but here it's just like you see half her face, and then they go, we can reconstruct the rest of her face using the backs of people's shoulders. It's just literally, there's a tiny portion of her face, yeah, the computer can build that. Can it? Really? and then the final confrontation scene with Riker as well, where he has solved the mystery. He is being the sort of noir detective, which I think is sort of halfway through the episode they decided they might want to do that. So he's fallen for the femme fatale, and he has to solve the mystery, but then gets heartbroken in the place as he brutally vaporizes her rather than just putting the phaser on kill.
The more you say it, the more I'm starting to think, well, maybe someone was trying to do a bit of a Blade Runner, because, I mean, there's not dissimilar parallels you can draw. I mean, obviously they're two very different things, but your leading man falling for a sort of cold face of a femme fatale who can never properly reciprocate their feelings because they're not human. They're a machine in one way or another. She's become a weapon. Rachel in Blade Runner is a literal biological machine. And obviously there's that Blade Runner reference, and I suppose even in a way you could sort of tie in the ending about him killing her and the retiring of androids. And I mean, it's loose, but it could have been possible. I'm not disruling it, and I mean, if it was, then it's appalling the way that it's been done.
That's the thing. I think it is just an incredibly badly executed attempt at that, and that's the only explanation I can come up with. And the only scene that kind of works is Riker having to kill her at the end and revealing what she's done. None of the setup to that works or makes any sense, and then she just confesses everything, and it still doesn't really make any sense. But the stuff with Riker, I think, is quite nice. It's a good performance from Jonathan Frakes there, and that's the only element of the episode that I think actually works. But if that's what they were trying to do, obviously it doesn't work.
Did you feel he played the conflict well enough? Because that scene where he is actually killing her, did you feel that the conflict was strong enough in him? Because I kind of felt that I could see where they're going with it, but
he was always going to kill her if that's what he had to do. I mean, it wasn't like, I'd a sort of, James Bond Vesper Lind moment where he's going to leave all this life and run off with her. Had that been the case, one, it would have had to be a lot more interesting and in depth than this, and two, it would have had to have made some kind of sense. So there isn't any conflict because he's always going to do the Riker thing because he's kind of a dull, straight up kind of guy.
But I feel they kind of want to have their cake and eat it with that, because then in the next scene you've got him depressed in the bar feeling the conflict, and I kind of feel it to an extent. Maybe I don't know, it doesn't sit well with me that they're trying to do both, because I don't feel enough of the sadness over the matter in the previous scene that the duty overtakes it to too great an extent for me. And I don't want to, I don't want it to be mawkish or overly sentimental, but I do feel it's not earned to the extent that it should be. And also because he's had all the advances towards her, but they've never been reciprocated enough for him to be that invested. I mean, so how do we take the end? Is it that he genuinely does have feelings for her? If so, it's a bit odd in a way, because there's not really been any sort of back and forth for them to do so, other than, say, some sort of physical attraction. Or is it some sort of pity? Is that what it is? And if so, why isn't that element of her being a tragic character played up more, with her not having a choice? Well, apparently not having a choice in her actions. How does she not have a choice in her actions? How has she been engineered to force her to carry on? Can she not stop what she's doing? It's never elaborated on. At
least in a way, it kind of gives an excuse to one of my bugbears for this episode, and one of my bugbears for this season in general, which is the appalling treatment of Marina Sirtis by just giving Troy nothing to do, or when they do give her something to do, it's rubbish. Because they have her here run up behind everybody when the guy dies. She is just around the corner, and yet she sensed nothing. A man has been murdered, and she sensed nothing. At least you've kind of got the out that, she's this genetically engineered machine type person, so maybe she couldn't read her emotions. But still, it's again Troy doing absolutely nothing. She does two things in this episode.
Surely she should be able to read the emotions of the frightened, then rapidly dying man.
She does two things in this episode. Not read a person's emotions who is dying, and then kind of cockblocks Riker, realises and walks away.
Oh God, wasn't that scene terrible? My God, that stank up the place.
Is that part of a sort of wider arc? They're kind of working on re-establishing that connection, that relationship, because they kind of implied about it in the last episode, and there's another scene with them together with their zero chemistry. And
it's the Ross and Rachel of space.
Yes, I suppose it is exactly that.
To be fair, at this point it would have been the Sam and Diane of space.
The other underused character is Dr. Crusher, who works out it's been a murder, sort of, somehow, by saying, this was a very specific virus and it's only been used once before. Hey, maybe if we download that database and have someone go through it, that'll make for some exciting television.
That's the most exciting television on ever made. People analysing databases.
And oddly, she goes through one database and Data goes through another database, and then they meet up and discuss what happened and bring up the photo, and it's just all, look, she's just there in this one photo we happen to have of this person right before he was murdered. It's lazy and it's rubbish, and it's probably the worst episode of this season by a long, long way.
Objectively, there's worse. And I mean, it's a phrase we've fallen back on before. There's nothing racist. There's nothing. So actually, there is something sexist, but not to the same extent as in other episodes. But it commits a worse cardinal sin. It's just dull. That's what makes it so bad. That you just can't invest in anything. Nothing's explained. It's, as I said before, it's just frustrating. It's really frustrating. But unlike the last episode, where you could forgive the Troy plot because the other plot wasn't bad and it had things that you thought, yeah, if you took that and expanded on that, that would be a really good episode. I don't know what you expand on here to improve this. I cannot think of a single element that would benefit from spending more time with it. I mean, you could do damage control. You could give her a bit more motivation, or at least you could explain her motivation. But it wouldn't make it good. It would just make you understand why it's happening.
Yeah, it's not enough to build an episode around. Or you can't build an episode around something so complicated in such a short period of time. There's too much and strangely too little going on at once in this episode. It does feel extremely light, but you've got all this backstory and all these motivations and all these characters who we never learn anything about, who have these centuries of war and clans and all these words that are just bandied around, which is never given any context or depth because they're just sitting in a room somewhere. But they do have something in common in that they all want some brandy.
Well, and then we reach the climax of the episode. He's killed her. The negotiations have been saved because of that. Riker's depressed. Picard says, well, I'm thinking of giving people a bit more shore leave. And Riker says, I'll tell the crew. And things end. What? What's if? What? But what about everything else in the plot? I mean, it's just such a sudden stop. It's like someone's missed a page of script out. If we're meant to be invested in these negotiations, why don't we know how they conclude? Because they can say that we've sort of seen how it's going, but we haven't. We saw them arguing over the semantics of what would be codified in their constitution with regards to their rights. Exciting stuff, kids, I know. But that was it. There wasn't a decision made. No agreement was made. And yeah, I mean, I'm not going to be more thrilled to find out how it does conclude, but clearly it's a big part of the plot, so surely you should know.
Again, I think there's something a bit strange about the number of characters in some way, because you introduce Brule, who actually I think is probably the best character in this, the leader of this pack of the, what are they called, the Gatherers, and
Kiss.
The leader of Kiss, Gene Simmons, and he's interesting. And then they go, oh no, there's a higher up guy who gets introduced in the last scene to sit in on the negotiations, and you just think, well, Why wouldn't you just go to the place that actually has the leader in it in the first place and deal with them and build out that character? The scene with Wesley, which clearly is written as filler, is at least interesting because you get to find out something about the character and how he has children, despite the fact there are clearly no women amongst Kith.
That felt like a C plot that was just starting to develop, and then it stopped. It was really odd. It felt like Wesley was going to become a part at the end of the episode, saying, "You misunderstand this guy, because in actual fact, he's got kids. Don't kill him. He's got kids." But that never happened.
He notices Wesley when he goes on the bridge, and then they have this conversation while he's doing his homework, and it's like, is he going to show him the value of passion and aggression over intellectualism or something, or anything at all? Because clearly they're picking at that particular scab, but then it just disappears, and therefore it just feels like it's a completely empty moment in the episode.
Did you notice during this scene that Wesley points at something on the computer and it's to nothing? He's pointing at the computer, showing him, I believe, where they're going, and it's nothing. Which I don't know if that's because of the Blu-rays have had to put the computer in place, recreating the assets, or not. But it seems very strange if that was in the original.
What it seems a remarkable metaphor for the episode. You're pointing at something and there's nothing there. We're heading towards nothing. But dragging us kicking and screaming back to the episode, I don't want people to think that we're sort of being just overtly harsh for the sake of it, because I think, if you judge every episode side by side as we have been doing, clearly this isn't good. It's just not. Objectively, it's just not good. But if you were to pick out something in this episode and say, there is the interesting premise and we can develop that, I mean, what would you settle for? Because I'm not saying that diplomatic... this is something you don't expect to ever hear yourself say. I'm not saying that diplomatic conferences can't be fun. But there's got to be a way of saving this, which is going to result in not just a little fix like a line of dialogue or a character's backstory. It's going to be quite a major shift in what the episode is, but there's got to be a way of saving it somehow.
Well, I think that Blade Runner reading, which might be completely wrong, if you do a Riker episode and you go for the full max, you have him doing his log like a kind of voiceover, and he's got caught up in this and it's got out of control, and because he's very buttoned down, maybe this woman that he's just drawn to so much that he's ended up doing this proper investigation and finding out about the past of the planet and all that, and then there's the big reveal at the end, and that kind of do a noir episode of The Next Generation, essentially, and that's an interesting way to frame it. But the way it is now, it's just it's nothing. You need Riker to be conflicted, and maybe that's a problem of Gene Roddenberry, because he doesn't like the characters to be conflicted, and that's the only way it can work, and I think you have to just highly stylize it.
I'd agree. I'd say there's something in that. It's the Riker stuff, specifically in the last two scenes, is where you would concentrate. And maybe you'd have to reverse things around. Maybe you'd have to find out that she has some sort of dreadful history and somehow she is redeemed, but he has to go through with his action for Christ knows what reason, just to play up the conflict more. And then have everyone at the end sort of say, well, you did the right thing, Will, but he's never convinced. But it's as you say, it's such a radical rewrite. It's not the same episode. It's two scenes. It's two scenes.
I guess if you have her personal needs and you tie this into the negotiation, what she wants, her ultimate happiness, is completely at odds with something which is at stake in the negotiations. And I think something does need to be at stake in these negotiations. There needs to be something for you to root for on either side. And that has to come into conflict. But there's not. It's just two groups of people you ultimately don't care about at all. So that has to have impersonal investment as well.
You don't care about the number of seats on the council?
No, I mean, they did a good seat joke when the Ferengi were there, but this seat material I can't really get on board with.
You do realise that sort of what we're lobbying here for is the emotional stakes of the child being put with this episode.
Well, even if the child is terrible, and it is...
Well, so's this.
The child is a kind of a mad idea, and at least it has that going for it. This is nothing, as you said at the start, and that's the problem. You can try to justify it all you want, you can come up with different ways of trying to make it interesting, but ultimately it won't be this episode if you put anything decent into it, because it's just a mishmash of absolute just mediocrity. And it's a shame, but I think we should all just forget about it and move on to next week.
Yeah, I mean, to use a metaphor like for this episode, it's like saying, here's your glass of cold water. Oh, maybe we could put some squash in it and make it interesting. Water. Oh, we could make it racier, you know, we could have some scotch mixed with water, nice alcoholic drink. Water. Oh, I just guess I'll have the water cold water.
Maybe some hot water.
Well, I'd advocate cold water for Riker. I mean, it could have saved us all a lot of bother. Just one cold shower.
Quickfire.
My absolute favourite part of the episode, and I've watched this scene twice now, and it doesn't become any less funny to me, is when Riker retires to his quarters and she turns up to see him there, and that's when he thinks that she's coming onto him. Because the way it's directed has Riker slumped down into his chair, and it films him from about the breast upwards, and it's got him sort of lying back with a look of ecstasy on his face, ecstasy and exhaustion, and it just stays there with him laid on the couch. Really looks like he's having a wank.
I need to point out that there's this thing on YouTube called TNG Edits, and that's one of the clips that they use to edit mini episodes of Next Generation, which, not your usual Next Generation episodes. This was the last episode that aired in the 1980s, and it feels every bit the 1980s.
The Federation Science Outpost, we spoke about that matte painting, it is a scenic background from Forbidden Planet, which is excellent because, of course, it was Star Trek before Star Trek.
I don't want to come across like the Nitpicker's Guide. Actually, is this mentioned in the Nitpicker's Guide? It probably is mentioned in the Nitpicker's Guide. Good Christ, it's not mentioned in the Nitpicker's Guide. Well, good. The view screen. When they're talking to the other member of KISS, I don't know, what are the names? Ace Freshley, is that one of them? Yeah, Ace Freshley, we'll call him Ace Freshley. When they're talking to him, they're looking at him on the view screen and they're looking at him dead on. And then there's another shot, which is taken from the side, and you can see him in profile. How's that work then? Have they got some sort of 3D screen?
You never see them all wear glasses on the bridge, so it's probably not 3D.
I mean, because it's very clearly a 2D screen.
Yeah, but it's kind of curved.
You can buy curved tellies. It doesn't mean that you can see around the side of an image.
It's a holographic view screen.
Like, do you ever see the camera on the bridge? And it always seems to focus centre on whoever's talking. They're smart cameras. They can go anywhere. They're just nanobots floating around in the sky.
We've really gotten into the groove of just rewriting the show here, haven't we? So Riker finds his phaser and he stuns her once. She keeps going. So he ups the setting and fires his phaser and stuns her twice. Both of these slowing her motion. She's not going to be able to quickly run over and force the brandy down his throat. Why does he then choose to up the intensity and just dissolve her?
Because nothing was going to stop her.
But what about if he just got out of his chair? Couldn't they have just, kept stunning her to slow her down, to stop her from moving towards him, and just had him leave the room and then imprison her? I mean, what in Christ's name is the justification there? What? The moral dilemma? Oh, Riker's so conflicted he had to kill her. No, he didn't.
Yeah, but he's all sad about it later.
Gets to go on shore leave, though.
Don't worry, number one. I thought we might visit that Justice planet. You liked that one, didn't you? Lots of naked people. Did any of them have a gash in their forehead like she did? No, but in many ways they were quite similar. Turning back for a moment to the backdrop from Forbidden Planet, Michael Okoda does say about it in Star Trek The Next Generation 365. He's quoted as saying, "We rented it. I saw it in a catalogue, and I've been lobbying the production designer to use it on the show for some time. He was perfectly willing to go along, so long as we used it for an appropriate episode." Do you think he was a bit pissed off?
Tasha Yar. She had all sorts of problems with Argus. Well, thank you once again for listening. Remember, you can find us on iTunes, and if you do, why not leave us a review like so many others have already? Always welcome. Next time we will be talking about the Defector, so do join us then. But for now, goodbye.
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 My dad's a referee, and he steals the pencils from IKEA because they're perfect for refereeing. Every single referee around Liverpool has IKEA pencils, and I'm sure around the country they all have IKEA pencils because they're perfect for refereeing.
When I was still in secondary school, they were the perfect size for a compass. Bear in mind, I didn't ever use a compass, so I really had no need for a pencil forward compass, but I had a compass. And I decided that I was quite bored in IKEA, and I thought, I'll stock up on some pencils. And I'm not quite sure how, other than the fact that I had a long coat on, but somehow I left with 562, I think it was.